We'll continue this morning and good morning, good morning.
She's making me feel bad. You make me feel
You just want up here close to when we're comparing the righteous to the wicked. I can have you.
First 3 rows back are righteous.
I wasn't making any generalities.
Yeah, right.
Oh my. Isn't it good to be together? It is good to be back with you. This morning we will continue to consider the wisdom of Solomon. Considering it as we have by topics, we began a couple of weeks ago to consider the broad topic of righteousness. Of course, as soon as you mention righteousness, then of necessity you're also mentioning the opposite. What again is the definition of righteousness as Solomon talks about it? Is he talking about being holier than thou or something like that, or being better than anybody else? What's he talking about? What's righteousness? Living by what? He's talking about living according to a set standard, practicing what is right and just and fair and equitable, and practicing it so regularly that it's become our normal way of being. We began to use a new definition of righteousness, one that comes actually from Scripture. It is noble living by noble plans in service to a noble king. And by that, we've been considering all the blessings that would derive from that. We first talked about how righteousness is manifested in our lives. We talked about the value of righteousness, both to ourselves and to others that we seek to bless. We began last week to consider what's God's relationship with the righteous. How does he feel about the righteous? What's he want to do because people who live for him are righteous? We considered from Proverbs 15 and verse 9 this attraction that God has for the righteous. It uses the word love there. And that particular word can be used either in a physical attraction or a spiritual one. But between God and those who are practicing righteousness, those who live the values which God approves, there's this magnetic attraction. That word lovely or love there means that he finds the righteous, their ways of living to be lovely, and he finds them lovable. And so there's this strong attraction. We began to consider the benefit of that. He certainly is hearing their prayers. We considered then that he's also granting their prayers. He cares for their physical needs. That's what we were considering at the end of the last class. And in total, here's what God is doing for those he finds lovely and lovable. Proverbs 3 and verse 3 takes us right back to the foundation of the rest of the Proverbs. In the rewards of wisdom, let's just start at chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For the length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Do not let, here's the key words, do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. In other words, wear them as an adornment for life. Write them on the tablet of your heart. What's the benefit of that then? Kindness and truth, by that he's talking about loyalty and trustworthiness. The righteous would be known for being loyal and trustworthy. Well, what's the benefit of that in verse 4? So you will find favor and good repute, both in the sight of God and the sight of man. Certainly we're concerned about being approved of God first, but it comes together. If you're living in such a way that you would be approved of other righteous people, then you're also approved by God. Yes.
I had a situation this last week with my granddaughter.
Uh-huh.
She's almost 18, and I went to voice her daughter. We had a great time back and everything. Well, as a couple days go on, it starts to kind of unwind about who we really are. And Artie and I was on our way back from Missoula, and Kelsey goes, "All you talk about, Mimi, is religion." And she meant it in a bad way, but that was the best compliment she could ever give me. Because everything about my life has to be God.
Well, it just told you that it's so radically different from what she's hearing day to day in Boise.
Yeah.
Because that's not what she's hearing there,
No,
is
it's
she?
not at all.
And so in that way it is shocking to her. Yes, sir.
So the contrast between kindness and wickedness, you like to be around people that exude kindness.
Yeah.
But people that are bitter, you just tend to reject them, and it's hard to be around those people. So kindness attracts.
And all of this is what Solomon describes as the means to a blessed life. Why? We'll get to a passage here. Why do you want to be with those people? We're actually going to see Solomon teaches you it might be best to even avoid those people, because not in a haughty, hateful way, we're not talking about, but really what is life in Solomon's term is a blessing for yourself and being a blessing to others. If somebody is proven in their character that they're going to tear you down, then maybe it's not, certainly that doesn't find favor with God and man. Yeah, Joe.
Well, Jeff and I were just talking about that this morning. I also had to look at that God is long-suffering. He is.
Extremely.
Extremely. So then we have to look at that in ourselves and our relationship with people too. That, yes, there are some people that are negative or bitter or whatever else, but then we have to look at the example of Christ and realize that there's times when I need to be exactly the same way. I need to be long-suffering and patient with people too. Now, there are times, like, someone doesn't want to hear, then I need to put my energies maybe on somebody else that wants to. But in the meantime, I still need to be open and be kind and loving to them. I may not have exactly the same relationship, but I still need to be.
It's up to the other person to open or shut the door.
Right.
For us, it's to be open. You know, Solomon talks about that. It's not only a blessing to ourselves, but these principles by which we live, we seek to win souls by them, he talks about. Seek to influence others. You want them to enjoy the same blessing. So, yes, you're open, but the other person has to choose.
It may be years. I mean, we want something to happen, results to happen right now. But your example may have an effect on them, maybe not now, maybe not 2 years, maybe not 5, but maybe, in a month.
You alluded to the contrast there, and we see the contrast again in Proverbs 10 and verse 6. In chapter 3, he talks about finding favor and a good reputation in sight of God and man. In chapter 10 and verse 6, here's the blessings, or here's the fruit of that. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. It's interesting how the words he uses to make a contrast. Head contrasted to mouth. And oftentimes we'll see mouth then contrasted to thoughts. And you work it backwards and you see where the problem begins. And if not the thoughts, then the heart. But blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. The difference is what's going on inside their head. which is often the problem, isn't it? That day when we don't take thoughts captive, and one little thought. I spent too many times in the past, one little thought, and sometimes it's a negative thought, and it starts playing like a recorded loop in your head. Like that commercial they play, 6 times in the middle of one show. That what's going on inside their head? God looks inside and he sees the true person's thoughts. One person's thoughts are lovely or lovable, and the others are an abomination. Either way, what do we know? That our thoughts will be judged. We've seen it in several of the Proverbs. Sometimes we think, well, it's only our actions that matter. No, it's not. Where's the actions begin? According to James 1. In the thought, in the temptation that you might give into. Either way, we know that each man's thoughts will be judged. Proverbs 11, verse 31.
I was just going to ask you, so your thoughts, if your thoughts are judged, but you don't do the negative thoughts that are in your head, then that's not the part. You're not being judged if you have that thought. It's just what you do if you act on that thought.
Yeah, James talks about it. The place to prevent the sin is when you first get the thought.
Right.
Before it becomes a really pulling temptation. Cut that off. Ultimately, you're thinking about what is pure until you no longer have those thoughts, ideally. But either way, it's going to be judged. Proverbs 11, verse 31, if the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, meaning in the present life, how much more will the wicked and the sinner? The reward in the present life is that sense of blessedness, sense of the confidence, knowing that you're doing right, knowing that you have favor with God. Doesn't mean everything's going to be rosy, but you know you have God's approval. Can the wicked enjoy that? Largely because they're not giving any thought to it, is often the problem. But how much more the wicked and the sinner? Let's look over to 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 18. 1 Peter 4 and verse 18. And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? How is it difficult even for the righteous to be saved? Because we're still living here in this old sinful world, aren't we? And as Peter writes to the Christians in this letter, all the turmoil that they're suffering, all the persecution that they're suffering, the temptation that's all around them. Yes, it's going to be difficult to keep their focus on God and to keep their lives guided by the truth. Mm-hmm.
But it's also an assurance to the righteous.
Sure. That the righteous will indeed be saved. Those who are practicing righteousness will indeed be saved. But what will become of the godless man? And in that sense, someone that doesn't live according to righteous standards, doesn't value those principles by which God would give life. And so each person's thought determines really the path that they choose. If you would go back to Proverbs 2 and verse 20. Proverbs 2 and verse 20. This follows the instruction, the description that describes wisdom as a godly woman and as the adulteress. By contrast, which one are you going to follow? Well, you've got to make the choice in verse 20. So you will walk in the ways of good men and keep the paths of the righteous. Tells you there is an example to follow. people have walked the way of righteousness before us. You can follow it. But to keep it, there's a steadfast determination in the word keep. And that shapes in the first part of that verse the way that you're going to walk. Just have to make that determination. Think about it. It's what Solomon's urging his own sons to do as he writes this. They've got to change the way they think and associate with those who are doing what is right. You can think of the rich princes of Israel. They're a pretty privileged lot, don't you think, Deborah? I mean, they probably think, well, rich daddy's the king. I can pretty much do what I want. And, by the number of verses he writes about those who reject discipline, the number of times he says, sons, hear my words and accept my words. He's trying to change the way they think, and by that, the associations. It mentions there the path of righteousness. What is the nature of the path of righteousness? Chapter 4 and verse 18. The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn. It shines brighter and brighter until the full day. If you're devoted to righteousness when you wake up in the morning, whether it's cloudy or clear outside, there's an optimism, isn't there? Like the light of the dawn. If you're living by noble principles, you don't know what the day holds when you wake up, but there is an optimism. There's a reason for hope. Yes, sir. Do you have something?
Well, just as you talk about choices is going to control whether you're suffering. You mentioned just in passing, but
yeah.
This whole thing is about the choices we make will impact our blessings or our unhappiness or whatever. So making the right choices is a big deal.
And we mentioned it last week. You and I talked a little bit more about it after class. This is all a book about preparation. You don't make these decisions in the heat of the moment when you're suddenly in trouble. You hear this, you accept it, you take it into your life, you apply it to yourself, you shape your life by it. And when you get in that place where others would be wrestling with a decision, do I do this or do that? It's already made.
It's easy to make the right choice.
It's your nature then. Solomon, as the older man, had a completely transformed nature. And so I see it more and more as a book of discipline, and you take all these disciplines and apply them to your life, and they become part of your nature. And in these times when you need to make a decision, it's in essence already made. It is part. In a careless moment, the tongue's likely to skim right off the top. Brings to mind skimming the cream off the top of a gallon of just milked cow, but it's going to skim right off the top. In all of this being a matter of a normal way of behavior, then, the path of righteousness in chapter 8 and verse 20. Here again, what's the character of that path? I walk in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice. Again, there's all these examples we can follow. The biblical examples, the examples of others who have proven this to be their nature and to be their matter. I like in the midst of the paths of the righteous. Again, there's a lot said about associations in the Proverbs. So if you're walking in the midst of a bunch of people, what's the likelihood that they're going to affect you? Pretty strong. And so, again, with whom are you in their midst? It makes a lot of difference. It's a progressive kind of picture. With those whom you're walking, it becomes a well-worn path, doesn't it? Talks about a walk, and over time it's a well-worn path. In Proverbs 16 and verse 18, here's quite an opposite case. Those who aren't walking in a way of righteousness tend to have this problem. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. You know, if you're staying in the path, walking in the way, you're not close to the shoulder or to the barrow pit on either side of the road. And so, but pride's a severe problem. Why does it lead to stumbling in verse 9? In chapter 16, verse 19. It is better to be humble in spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. This gets right back to the heart of the premise of becoming wise. What is required to become wise? From the very start of the Proverbs, chapter 1, what's required? Humility. Humility. Because without humility, then one does not fear God. And if one does not revere the things of the Lord, that's the surest way to stumble. Yes, Jill?
Well, we go back to applying this every day. And Dana was in Luke, and so I was noticing the one in Luke 5, starting in 27, talks about, "But I say to you, hear and love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." You go over to 32, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same." Now that is a hard choice. I mean, we know the right choice, but it's hard to do that. You know, I mean, we know this is what he's telling us.
Yep.
So when you start taking everything he's saying in Proverbs and the scriptures and start applying it to everyday life,
i.e. practicing it every day of your life. That's the preparation.
that's the preparation. So we're in relationships. We're talking about someone that is isolated. What happens? You can come up in your own mind about things, and that's where when you're in relationships, and especially in the church, you're with people, and people are sinners. You know?
And if they're godly people who truly love you, they're keeping you in check, aren't they? Both encouraging you, but also keeping you in check. That's, again, the value of association in practicing all that.
And it is a practice, because there's sometimes that you're thinking, I don't feel like doing something
Roger,
Yeah, it's hard.
Roger, what's the problem with your neighbor who's all alone? What happens to her thoughts? The one we were talking about the other night. Gets out there, a little out there. But, you know, that
Once again, as Christians, how are we supposed to respond to that? That's it's easy to talk about it, and it's easy to say, and it's easy to know the choices are here, but actually doing it,
yeah, as you just read in that passage, you've got to have already practiced that and prepared it, so you
gotta take
do.
a couple deep breaths and say, okay, what does God want me to do? Well, sometimes He's telling you to lean into the punch, but
The
But you're still, if you're doing what God is telling you, isn't that what we're talking about? That's the peace, right?
Yep.
It may not be peaceful, but we know that in the long run, it will be.
back away and pray. That's it. Sometimes that's the answer.
We are talking about a matter of lifestyle, a matter of a well-practiced lifestyle. In that way, all the paths of the righteous in total come to what Solomon would describe as really living. This is life at its best. Proverbs 12, verse 28. In the way of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. Again, way in the first half, and you follow the way so often it becomes a well-worn pathway. How does Solomon talk about life and death? What is life? Spiritual blessedness. What is death? The absence of that. Outside of the pathway of righteousness, there's only trouble. There's only trouble. Or you could contrast that with blessings and cursings. In the way of life is blessing, in the pathway, and in its pathway there is no cursing from God. No cursing from God or man, ideally. But again, as we've talked about, this is something we practice. Such a person is known by their reputation. That's really what Solomon's concerned about. In that definition of righteousness, being fair and just and equitable and normal, he's talking about reputation. And they're known for having a mouth speaking in righteousness. Solomon's never more than, it seems, a page or two away from this topic of the mouth. Proverbs 8, verse 7 and 8. Again, as you just alluded to, Jill, if you get caught in the heat of the moment, you've got to know ahead of time how you're going to treat that person. And it's got to be determined before you get in that. For my mouth will utter truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the utterances of my mouth are in righteousness. When righteousness is defined as living according to a set of noble principles, then that's what shapes the utterances of our mouth. There is nothing crooked or perverted in them. Nothing. Not in what's said, not in what's intended, not in what is, there's no twisting of the words, there's no, innuendo, there's no slight in it. You can take the words at face value. In being the mouth of truth and being the mouth of righteousness, again, speaking what is true. We talked about that word kindness and that phrase kindness and truth. That's loyalty and trustworthiness. Speaking what is trustworthy is there's the benefit of having a reliable standard. It is, again, why Solomon so often urges his sons, as in chapter 1, verse 8, hear, son, your father's instruction. Chapter 4 and verse 8, hear, my son, and accept my sayings. Why? Because they are trustworthy for a blessed life. The old-fashioned word for hear in that verse is the Hebrew word shema, and it means hearken to. And it's a musical term, meaning strike the bell loudly. And every one of these, he wants his sons to hear him hitting the bell soundly and hear that clear ring. It carries with it as well to the need to obey. The mouth of the righteous makes life enjoyable. This is what you alluded to earlier, Roger. Proverbs 10 and verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Interesting the contrast of the words. One is life, the other is violence. That's the fruit of the mouth. Well, if it's not a well-trained or well-controlled mouth, if it interesting in the word conceals there. You know, the people who speak wickedness, they're trying to hide the deception, aren't they? They're not going to come out and tell you, well, now this is just bald-faced garbage, are they? They're going to twist it in a sense to conceal the motives. And so it is again about reputation. The previous proverb, the truth is contrasted with deception, and here's the result of that. Either life or violence, blessedness or trouble. Violence is really the death of blessed life, isn't it? Violence doesn't mean necessarily that you're killing somebody. It's just an unprincipled life. And so the words are either enjoyable like a fountain of life, or they're really a cesspool of trouble. Again, on the hearer's part, implied is how the hearer reacts to the words. That's one thing. But on the other part, the one who's speaking, their words ought to be taken or be able to be taken at face value. That you don't have to wonder, well, that's what they said, but what was she really saying, you know? That's that kind of anxiety that you have to wonder, well, I know what they said, but is that really what they meant? That's no life in that. And so it ought to be. That whether for Solomon the king or for his princes, the sons, or for anyone in Israel at that time, it ought to be that their words are taken at face value. And the words are beneficial for blessedness. In chapter 16 and verse 13. Notice there in 16 and verse 13. Again, the result of this, righteous lips are a delight of kings, and he who speaks right is loved. What can the king trust of others? If you picture those in his kingdom, what's the assurance? These people are submissive to the king. Righteous lips are a delight of kings, and he who speaks right is loved. Politics aside, this one reminds me of a story I heard about why Mike Pence was selected as vice president. It said when the decision was being made and they interviewed all these people, that the first lady actually told Mr. Trump at the time to pick Pence because she could see in him, this was a man who knew his place. If he was vice president, he would know his place. He wasn't going to try to usurp his position. He was going to be subordinate, and he's not trying to take what's not his. And that's what this kind of reputation is. He's a reliable surrogate, and he was favored in that way. We ought to be that way, aside from all the politics stuff. It ought to be that we can be favored by God and man because we're not trying to get over on somebody. We're not trying to hoist ourselves up. We know our place. Again, it's about humility. And that is the trustworthy reputation of a principled man. Whether you agree with him or not, but isn't it good to have that kind of reputation? That people could see that in him. Here's a man with this set of principles, and he lives by them. And so there is favor in that. There's also the blessing in chapter 10 and verse 21. That the words he speaks are a substance. They are the lips of the righteous, for chapter 10, verse 21. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of understanding. Well, the righteous are feeding knowledge. The fools have so long rejected knowledge that they die for lack of understanding. The the implied contrast here is many are filled or many are lacking. The lips of the righteous feed many. This one paints a picture of even some animals, some birds and even some apes would feed many. How do some birds feed the babies? By regurgitating. Penguins do that, I think. Eat the food, regurgitate it. I looked the other day to see if it was true, and there are some apes, sometimes orangutans will do that. They'll eat the food and regurgitate it to feed their young. Well, that's what it's talking about. The righteous are, in a sense, regurgitating. They've taken in this sound teaching. They've applied these principles to their lives. They've figuratively digested it. They've lived well on it. And so you give it to others. They're feeding. So you get the picture from the mouth of one that very many are being fed.
Well, it's kind of like a circle because you read this, you apply it, people are watching. You don't realize how many, you think maybe you might be in secret, okay, but when you have the knowledge and you're living it, then what comes out of your mouth is trustworthy. But if you're living a lifestyle contrary to what you're trying to teach, it's going to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah, and that's the disconnect, really. We are talking about a well-practiced and proven reputation. And so it is, what comes out of their mouth is righteous counsel, good advice, trustworthy for blessing. What comes out of the rest, well, not so good. But in that, what becomes apparent? Again, what becomes apparent is just what you said. Is what they say really who they are? And why would I trust what they say if it's not who they are? And so, sometimes just in a silly, careless moment, we might say something totally foolish. But again, Solomon's talking about reputation, proven reputation. And so it is in that the motive becomes apparent and is so much more valuable when that's proven. Look at Proverbs 10 and verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is as choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. Tongue contrasted to the heart. One's valuable, one's like precious silver, the other one's like the slag that floats off or is pulled off the silver. There's the valuable. The counsel that we would get is valuable. It is substance to others. Look at Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6. It's the first of those 12 minor prophets, Hosea 4 and verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. Again, as we see in Solomon, it's available. Everybody can have all the knowledge they want. But they have rejected knowledge. I will also reject you from being my priest, since you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children. You see, what was the problem with those wicked priests? They didn't treat knowledge as being precious, did they? To them, it was just worthless slag. In other words, to eat the counsel of fools is a way that's leading to death, isn't it? Nothing good in it. In contrast, the mouth of the righteous flows with wisdom, Proverbs 10 and verse 31. The mouth of the righteous flows with wisdom. Let's pair it with the first half of 32. The lips of the righteous bring forth what is acceptable. So there's both what is gained and what is the result, what is acceptable. By contrast, the perverted tongue will be cut out, the mouth of the wicked, those who speak what is perverted. Cut out's an interesting phrase there. In essence, the blessings will be cut off. Those who speak what is perverted, can they expect? I mean, what is perverted, we've already considered, is that which stirs up violence. Can you in any way expect God to look upon that with favor? The cut out or cut off implies being spiritually bankrupt, bereft of any value for life versus acceptable. And so the question is, acceptable to whom, as we began earlier? It would find favor both with God and with man. Well, it brings us back, we'll end here where we began earlier. This really, it's a summary proverb, Proverbs 15, verse 9. Regarding the righteous, whose ways God finds lovable and finds the people lovely. It says there, God is pursuing them. Those who are pursuing righteousness, God is pursuing them to bless their lives. There's that mutual attraction. They're highly favored by God because they're pursuing righteousness. In turn, He's pursuing them to give them the richest blessings of life. And with that, I guess we best call that a stopping point.